I was born on the 30th of November 1874 in England, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. Of mixed English and American descent, my parents, famous politicians, were part of the English aristocracy. I therefore grew up far away from them, as was the custom at the time. During my time at school I faced academic difficulties, ranging from diction problems to stammering and memory problems. These difficulties were progressively overcome during my teenage years through the persistence and resilience that I maintained, and which accompanied me for the rest of my life. In the process, I discovered my passion for fencing, literature and English history, especially in the military sphere. In order to combat my somewhat disordered behavior, my father directed me towards physical activities so that I could pursue a military career. After 2 attempts, I entered the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst in 1893. In 1894, I graduated as a cavalry cadet with distinction. The following year I was sent to the Cuban conflict where I fought alongside the Spanish in the War of Independence. I was a soldier, but my passion for writing led me to work as a journalistic correspondent. During the dark times that followed, I wrote reports and sent them to the Daily Graphic in London. While fighting a war in South Africa, I was taken prisoner. Fortunately, I managed to escape, and after several disorientated days I made it to British territory. I was given a hero's welcome, everything I needed to embark on the political career that was to follow in the next decade. My father, a politician of stature, was part of the hierarchy of the Conservative Party. With such influence, I joined the party and was elected as a member of the House of Commons in 1900, but only for a short time. The Conservatives took positions that I didn't like at all. It wasn't the kind of ideology I identified with, and so I clashed several times with the conceptions they put forward, particularly on the economic issue of a return to economic protectionism. So in 1904 I joined the Liberal Party, which was on the rise at the time. From 1905 onwards, I accumulated other government positions, and I can even say that I was the most popular personality in the government, the one that everyone waited to hear speak. With a mandate in the Liberal government in 1905 I took over the Undersecretariat of the portfolio responsible for colonial administration. Among various actions, I would highlight the importance I gave to encouraging the recognition of the dignity of colonized peoples under the colonizers. Repudiating, as I once said, the repugnant butchery of the natives. In 1908, I became Minister of Commerce. I worked quickly in defense of free trade and the adoption of social protection measures and support for the working classes. That was also the year I met and married Clementine Hochia. In a marriage that was considerably rushed, we had 5 children. Years later, in 1911, I took up the post of First Lord of the Admiralty, the Royal Commander of the British Navy. My first action was in response to the great German power. To put it in context, the climate of armed peace prior to the First World War was already being felt in Europe. Germany, perhaps as a precautionary measure, announced a program to better militarize its army. It would be appropriate to react too, and so I did. Britain declared that we were going to overtake Germany by modernizing and structuring our navy and military equipment more efficiently. I was severely criticized by my own party. When the conflict broke out in 1914, it was I who led the first British naval operations. Following the invasion of Belgium by German troops, the United Kingdom issued an ultimatum that was not heeded. In fact, participation in the war was already premeditated, a complex combination of diplomatic, strategic and moral factors based on agreements with other nations, notably France. I led the Royal Navy to effectively blockade German ports and then to transport troops to the battlefields. I realized very early on that the conflict required a robust presence on the battlefields, so I also drove the transformation of the British Expeditionary Corps. In May 1915, I resigned from the Admiralty. After the Battle of Gallipoli, in a Turkish province, I consented to a strategic error that cost the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers. This failure led to my removal from the management of the conflict, but not from its field of action. I offered to continue as a soldier and was mobilized to France, where I served for a few months. I didn't leave the government completely. I returned to office in 1917, when I was appointed Minister of Munitions, and when I stood out for my opinion of sending soldiers to fight in the White Army and to counter communism. In 1918, I also played an important role in designing the People Act, which granted some women the right to vote in the UK. Although universal suffrage wasn't approved until later, my concern for the expansion of democratic rights for all citizens is clear. I was appointed Secretary of State for War and Secretary of State for Aviation in 1919. In this role I took responsibility for the demobilization of British troops. This was followed by moments of sensitivity and humanitarianism. In a depression and social anomie that was overwhelming Europe, I pushed for the creation of the Council of Europe to unify us again as countries, maintain unity and peace and return to the most prosperous period our continent had ever seen. In 1924, I returned to the Conservative Party, where I remained for the rest of my life. At this time, my famous phrase, "Anyone can desert, but it takes a certain amount of ingenuity to return." In fact, since the end of the war, the Conservatives had seen some political growth, especially due to their proposals for economic recovery. So, I made my decision so that I could continue to navigate the political landscape while maintaining my relevance and influence. During this period, I was notable for my strong criticism of the Nazi Party in Germany. From an early stage, the ideology seemed to me to be exaggeratedly extremist, violent and perhaps dangerous, which would be confirmed years later. I tried several times to warn British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain that Germany's calm in Europe should be seen as dubious and that the world would regret the Treaty of Versailles, but I was always ignored. I often sent the government requests to invest in militarization in preparation for possible German attacks. I was often accused of being a warmonger. At the beginning of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. As one of the main European powers, we tried to appease the situation together with France, but Adolf Hitler didn't give in and continued his policy of conquering living space. I returned to the post of First Lord of the Admiralty and directed the first defensive actions carried out in the Nazified countries. In a short space of time, the British Prime Minister realized the critical moment that Europe and, of necessity, his country were in and, unable to reverse the situation, resigned from his post. And that's when I was chosen to rise to power. King George VI recognized my oratory skills, my experience in leading troops and my clear vision of Nazism. He invited me to form a government and I took office on the 10th of May 1940, on a critical day for the Allied offensive. As a brilliant strategist, I made memorable speeches calling on the British people to resist. On a military level, I simultaneously took on the role of Minister of Defense in order to have direct control over military strategy. On a political level, I approached US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a strategy to get them to enter the war for good, which proved crucial to the Allies' success. Intertwined with retaliations, advances and retreats, World War II officially reached a turning point in 1941, when the USSR joined the Allied powers. In 1943, the Inter-Allied Peace Conferences began, to organize the last considerations of the war as well as to discuss the punishments for the losers. I took part in inter-alliance summits, for example in Tehran and Yalta. Together with Roosevelt and Stalin we partly planned the UN, the division of Germany and Berlin and mass denazifications. I also started the Potsdam Conference. However, I received the news that I had lost the election to Clement Attlee and his Labour Party, which had been on the rise since the beginning of the war. I remained in Parliament as leader of the opposition, always intervening in politics and defending the promises and decisions I had made as Prime Minister. In 1946, I uttered the famous term Iron Curtain in a speech in which I warned of a possible division of the world into two poles of influence, the USA and the USSR. We could even say that this was when the Cold War began. In 1951, I returned to the position of Prime Minister. My duties included completing the development of a nuclear weapon that had been started by the previous government. In 1953, I was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for my work, The Second World War, in which I portrayed my memories of the war, as well as for all my literary and journalistic output. I was hailed as the greatest living Briton. In 1955, I resigned to take care of my health. I didn't abandon politics altogether, but my presence in Parliament has become a rarity since then. I died on the 24th of January 1965 as a result of a stroke. The funeral, held a few days later, was attended by more than 350 million people, making it the largest state funeral in history.